Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Cheryl Reynolds with the UC statewide IPM program. Welcome to today's UC Ag Expert Talk on ground squirrel and pocket gopher management on orchard crops. Peter Casina will be running our polls and troubleshooting any technical problems. Please note that the webinar is targeted to growers and pest management professionals. Master gardeners can certainly benefit from participating, but the pest management methods presented, especially the pesticides, are not to be followed without a clear understanding of their legal use by homeowners. And you can see a list of the topics that we've already covered in our webinar series. You can go to that playlist to view any that you may have missed or may want to view again. And just a special thank you to the Citrus Research Board for their support in our webinar series. Close that out. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Today we have Dr. Roger Baldwin. He's an Associate Cooperative Extension Specialist at UC Davis. And today he will be speaking on ground squirrel and pocket gopher management in orchard crops. And so now, Roger, I'm going to pass this over to you and you can share your screen.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So we are going to be talking about managing ground squirrels and pocket gophers today. So hopefully you're logged into the right topic here. Since we are going to be talking about managing gophers and ground squirrels, I thought it would obviously be important to provide some basic introductory information about both of these species. So we're going to start off with some information about ground squirrels. In this case, I'm talking specifically about the California ground squirrel, which is the ground squirrel species that causes most of the conflict situations in California. California ground squirrels are grayish brown in color. They have a semi-bushy tail. They also have a speckled type appearance. If you look closely at the photo here, you can see that general speckled appearance. So those are some of the diagnostics we use to identify ground squirrels. They are social and diurnal. That means the diurnal part means they're active during the daytime. Social obviously means they live in groups. So we do generally find them in groups running around in the daytime. That's a pretty easy recipe for you to figure out what species or to figure out that excuse me, that ground squirrels are the species that are out there causing potential conflict in some situations. Contrast that with a lot of other rodent species. You oftentimes don't see them out there. You don't see them running around at all. You really see are signs of damage or signs of their activity. And in those cases, it can be a little bit more challenging to figure out that they're causing conflict or damage. That's usually not an issue with ground squirrels. We can pretty easily tell they're out there and that they're causing problems. The damage that they cause can be quite extensive and quite varied. It does include girdling of trees, and that's what this photo at the bottom right is showcasing. The ground squirrels will climb up into the trees and they can feed on the bark. Obviously, when they get up into the trees, they can feed on fruits and nuts as well. Very common form of damage. They'll also consume forbs and grasses. So if we're talking about rangeland settings, that's problematic. They chew on irrigation lines. This is one of the more common forms of damage that we see from ground squirrels. Literally results in millions of dollars of damage annually. And then their abundant burrow openings cause lots of potential problems as well. If we're talking about nut crops, we can actually see nuts lost down through the burrow system. They can be a hazard to farm workers and farm laborers. We can see increased soil erosion issues associated with water channeling down burrow systems, et cetera. So lots of potential concerns when it comes to ground squirrels. The amount of damage or loss in revenue can vary depending upon cropping systems. These are just some of the different cropping systems that we surveyed here a number of years ago. Nuts and rangelands are the two primary agricultural production systems where we see damage from ground squirrels, but certainly it applies to lots of other systems as well. And then also, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about pocket gophers today as well. In fact, pocket gophers are probably the #1 rodent pest in production ag in the state of California. They're found throughout most of the state. They are burrowing rodents about 6 to 8 inches in length. Of course, gophers spend the vast majority of their life below ground though. So for us to know that they're present in an area, we have to look for some form of sign. And the sign that we're usually looking for are their mounds. This is an example of a typical gopher mound here in the bottom right. usually horseshoe shaped in appearance with a plug towards the lower end of one side of that mound. So that can be a good diagnostic to help you figure out that you have gophers present in an area. The damage that they cause can be quite extensive and quite varied as well. It can include direct consumption of taproots of plants, which can weaken and or kill those particular plants, probably the most common form of damage we see from gophers. If we're talking about tree or vine crops, they will also girdle those trees or vines below ground. If you have girdling damage that occurs above ground, it's usually from some other species, but if it's below ground, it's generally from pocket gophers. We see problems associated with their mounds as well. They also can cause damage to farm equipment. They're hazardous to farm laborers. We see increased soil erosion concerns. We also see proliferation of weeds associated with their mounds. That's because when they're bringing that soil up to the surface, it oftentimes contains weed seed. And so that can be problematic there too. For gophers, the #1 crop that we see damage in is clearly alfalfa, but they also cause lots of damage in other crops, including grapes, nuts, tree fruit, etc. And when it comes to managing gophers and ground squirrels, we certainly do recommend that individuals utilize an integrated approach. And with integrated approach, what I'm talking about is focusing on multiple strategies. We do generally see better results when we use multiple strategies than if you were to focus on any single one approach. So for example, perhaps you have a vineyard with extensive gopher problems. Maybe you would initially start off with a bait application, such as what we see in the top right here, to try to knock down that population. So that might be your initial step. But it's important to remember that with a lot of these tools, such as bait, for example, not all the gophers may want to feed on that bait. Some of them may not have any interest in feeding on it at all. And so if you keep using bait application exclusively to try to manage that gopher population, then you're always going to miss a subset of those individuals out there in that population. And the more and more you rely on it, the greater that proportion is going to be. So the best strategy then would be to come back with an alternative approach to target some of those remaining individuals. Trapping is just one of those tools that you could use to try to target some of those remaining individuals. Again, the important point to remember here is that mixing and matching these tools long term is generally going to give you better results than relying on any single one approach. It's also important to understand a little bit about the biology of these species that you're trying to manage, as well as the ecology of the system that you are working in, as this can greatly influence the efficacy of a management program as well. And hopefully this chart at the right will do a good job of helping to illustrate this. This chart was designed specifically for the California ground squirrel. And what we have on this chart are major activity periods for ground squirrels, major food resources, and the best time for control for 3 of the more commonly used strategies to manage ground squirrels. And of course, this is broken down across the different seasons of the year. So what do we notice when we look at this chart? Well, there's obviously lots of information on here, but one of the items I want to bring to your attention are the food resources. You see here that there are basically 2 food resources that ground squirrels focus on. Those are green foliage and seeds. In the springtime, when ground squirrels emerge from hibernation, they're feeding primarily on green foliage because that green foliage is nutritious and it's abundant. And so that's what they're feeding on. Why is this important? Well, it's important because if you wanted to use rodenticide baits to manage ground squirrels, those baits are generally seed or pelletized type products. So if you want to utilize something that's seed-based, you probably need to wait until later in the year when they're actively feeding on seeds. And that's what this is representing here. We see that bait application does generally work better when ground squirrels are feeding on seeds. And so if you want to use bait, you need to wait until later in the year to utilize it. So what might you use if you wanted to manage ground squirrels in the springtime? Well, it turns out that burrow fumigants work quite well in the springtime. And the reason why is that for fumigants to be effective, you need relatively high soil moisture. When you have high soil moisture, that closes off the pores in the burrow system, holds those toxic gases in at a much greater rate. So we see much better efficacy for burrow fumigants when utilizing them in situations where you have abundant soil moisture. And here in California, Mediterranean climate, that usually represents late winter through springtime. So if you want to use the fumigants, that's the time to use them. So these are just a couple of examples of how knowing a little bit about the biology of the species that you're trying to manage, as well as the ecology of the system that you're working in, can greatly influence the efficacy of a management program. So with that quick introduction to some basic information, I think it's time for our first poll question. Peter, if you want to go ahead and pop that up, we can cover that. So the question is, California ground squirrels cause which kind of damage? We have A, girdling of trees and vines above ground, B, consumption of fruits and nuts, C, chewing damage to irrigation lines, and D, all of the above. I'll give you a few seconds to contemplate and answer. Okay, so it looks like you guys are pretty good listeners. We have 98% on all of the above, and that is correct. All of these different factors are kinds of damage that ground squirrels can cause. So good job, everybody. Let's do the next one. Okay, so the next question, pocket gophers cause which kind of damage? A, extensive girdling of trees and vines above ground. B, frequent transmission of diseases to humans. C, feeding on taproots of plants, often leading to mortality of the plant. Or D, all of the above. All right, so I have my first failure, and none of you had any issues associated with it. I forgot to talk about disease transmission, which is not a concern with gophers at all, and so everybody apparently inherently knew that, so that is awesome. And it seems like the vast majority of you got this question correct. Gophers can cause extensive girdling of trees and vines, but that is below ground, and so you saw through that one. So yeah, the primary form of damage in this particular poll was feeding on taproots of plants, often leading to mortality of the plant. And so let's move on to question 3. Okay, question 3. Which of the following is a good season to apply burrow fumigants for ground squirrels? Is it A, early winter, B, early spring, C, early summer, or D, early fall? Or could it be E, all of the above? Okay, great. The majority of you got this one correct as well. It is B, early spring. Sometimes you can get by with fumigation in late winter, which would be early to mid-March, but that varies from location to location depending upon when ground squirrels come out of hibernation. They do have to be out of hibernation for the fumigants to work. So the correct answer was B, early spring. It is possible to use fumigants at other times of the year if you are irrigating. If you are irrigating and have sufficient soil moisture, then you can use the burrow fumigants. It doesn't have to be just in that springtime when you have natural precipitation, but generally the fumigation is done in that period where you do have natural precipitation. Okay, so that's it for the first set of questions. So moving on in the presentation, we're now going to start talking about some of the different control options that are available. And this chart is a small representation of some of the different tools that are out there when it comes to managing these species. It is probably, these are probably some of the more common tools for managing both ground squirrels and pocket gophers. And you will see that there is definitely some overlap across these two different species. Certainly habitat modification, bait application, and with baiting, I'm talking about the use of rodenticide baits, burrow fumigation and trapping. All of these are tools that can be used to manage ground squirrels and pocket gophers, and they are all tools that I am going to be talking about more extensively here today. Exclusion is a tool that we sometimes use for certain vertebrate species. It doesn't really work well at all for ground squirrels because they're very good climbers and they're very good diggers, so they can get around most of the exclusionary devices that we can put out there. For pocket gophers, I do have a question mark here. That is because if we're talking about a backyard setting, there are ways you can potentially exclude gophers from flower beds, from tree roots, things along those lines. But for production ag situations, exclusion really doesn't work well for gophers either. Repellents, there are repellents marketed for both of these species. In fact, there's repellents marketed for just about all vertebrates out there. The problem is that repellents oftentimes do not work well for many of these vertebrate species, and that certainly is the case for ground squirrels and pocket gophers, at least at this point in time. Same thing applies for frightening devices too. Now, I will mention that shooting is a tool that can be used to manage ground squirrels and is sometimes used to manage ground squirrels in certain areas. But obviously, there are limitations on where shooting can be applied. Obviously, it has to be legal to discharge a firearm in a given area. But if you are in those kind of situations, shooting is a tool that can be used to manage ground squirrels. Now, another tool that can be used that wasn't included on the previous slide is biocontrol. And with biocontrol, we're talking about the use of natural predators to help control pest populations. When we're talking about biocontrol, probably the most common example that's provided would be the use of barn owls to try to manage some of these rodent populations. The way that is implemented is the erection of barn owl boxes up around properties. The basic premise here being to get barn owls to utilize those nest boxes to hopefully have their young and then be hunting in that particular area. Sounds good in practice or in theory. In practice, we're still not sure how effective they actually can be at reducing rodent populations. There actually is quite a bit of research going on currently looking at the potential utility of barn owls to try to manage some of these rodent populations. I'm involved in some of these projects. Based on some of our initial early work, it seems to suggest that if you're dealing with very abundant rodent populations, then barn owls probably are not going to be enough to substantially reduce those populations. But if we're dealing with populations of rodents that are already relatively low out there, then they may be able to keep those populations at a somewhat lower level. But again, this is not at all conclusive. We're still trying to get a better feel for the utility of barn owls for trying to manage some of these rodent species. So just keep that in mind if it's something that you want to utilize. Also, I will point out that barn owls, they do predate heavily on pocket gophers, but they do not feed on ground squirrels. Ground squirrels are active during the daytime, owls are active at night, so they don't coincide. So don't plan on using barn owls to manage ground squirrel species. Conversely, we do sometimes see raptor perches that are put up out there on the landscape. The basic premise here, trying to get various raptor species to utilize those areas. And those can be used in theory to try to manage ground squirrels because a lot of these raptors, including hawks and eagles, do predate on ground squirrels. However, there is very little information out there to suggest that these kind of raptor perches are overly effective at managing ground squirrel populations. So they're not something that I would probably get too excited about using based on the information we currently have. All that said, it's always great to have these predator species out there, and they certainly do feed on some of these rodents. And so it's nice to have predators out there on the landscape. We want to have them out there on the landscape, and it certainly does no harm to put up raptor perches, owl boxes, and things like that to provide, any potential benefit that they might be able to provide. Now, another tool that we do have in our toolbox to use to try to manage burrowing rodents is habitat modification. And with habitat modification, we're talking about altering the desirability of an area for a particular species. And there's lots of examples that we can provide for habitat modification. One of those pertains to ground squirrels, and that's brush piles. We oftentimes see brush or pruning piles around the edge of orchards. Here's an example of what one of those brush or pruning piles might look like. Those are great harborage sites for lots of different species, including ground squirrels, but also rabbits, roof rats, birds, etc. So having those kinds of brush or pruning piles is likely to increase your potential problems with some of these vertebrate species. So the sooner you can get rid of them, the better off you're going to be when it comes to managing some of these vertebrate issues. Burrow destruction is another strategy that you can use. This has been tested for ground squirrels. This was some work a predecessor of mine did a number of years ago, and what they found is that when you destroy old burrow systems, that can slow down reinvasion rates. So if you think about an area that you have ground squirrels in and you implement a management program to try to get rid of ground squirrels in that particular area, even if you're 100% successful and get rid of all the ground squirrels out there, unless your neighbors have also gotten rid of all their ground squirrels, then there's a strong likelihood that some of those ground squirrels are probably going to move back into your property and reinvade some of those old burrow systems, because it's very easy to just come back in and use the burrow systems that have already been created. So if you can destroy those old burrow systems, then that slows down the potential for adjacent populations to move back into the core areas of those fields. So deep ripping to destroy those old burrow systems can be a good tool to slow down that reinvasion. Some of this previous work did suggest, however, that for ground squirrels, you have to get 1.5 feet deep in destroying those old burrow systems for this to be effective. They found that 1 foot was not sufficient for slowing down reinvasion. You really had to get down to 1.5 feet. So it takes a very concerted effort. The places where this is probably going to have the greatest utility are in situations maybe where you have orchard or vineyard crops where you've had extensive problems in the past with gophers or ground squirrels, and you're going to take them out of production and replant them. Before you replant, if you could go through and deep rip those fields to destroy those old burrow systems, that can be a good tool to help give you a leg up in trying to manage those fields moving forward for gopher and ground squirrel problems. Now, this hasn't been looked at specifically for gophers in the past, but the application is likely equally valid for gophers as it is for ground squirrels. You probably don't have to go as deep for gophers, though. My guess is maybe 1 foot deep might be enough there. And then also, just trying to manage or control weed sources in some of these different crops can be a good way to help reduce problems, particularly when it comes to gophers. Keep in mind, there are certain plants that gophers like to feed on. Those are oftentimes your nitrogen-fixing plants, such as your clovers and legumes and things along those lines, as well as plants that have large fleshy taproots. So getting rid of some of those plants in cover crops can be a good way to help reduce some of that carrying capacity or potential for harboring large populations of gophers. Completely getting rid of cover crops or weed resources out there is an even better way to reduce some of that potential with gophers. But there is a caveat to that, and that is if you already have extensive gopher populations out there and you have cover crops, if you go through and get rid of the cover crop before you remove the gophers, now what you're probably going to do is increase pressure on, in this case, the vines that are out there, because now you've removed that primary food source and the only food source left is the crop. So what you need to do is get rid of the gophers first, then deal with your habitat modification through removal of cover crops or alteration of some of the plants that are out there in those cover crops. So it is important that you get rid of the gophers first before you make those kinds of changes so you don't see increased damage there. Now, another tool that we frequently use to manage gophers and ground squirrels is trapping. We're going to start off by talking about trapping for ground squirrels. There are a variety of different kinds of traps that are out there for dealing with ground squirrels. These can basically be lumped into 2 categories, and those are your kill traps and your live traps. Examples of kill traps include body gripping traps, such as the Conibear 110 that you see here. Tube or tunnel style traps, which can be placed along ground squirrel runways. And then there are box type squeeze traps that can be used as well. The basic premise behind these is that they are kill traps. So when the animal runs in, it squeezes them and it kills the animal. Conversely, you have live traps, such as the traps that you see here in the bottom right. These are traps that allow the animal to come in, step on the treadle here in the back, triggers the door shuts behind him, the animal is captured alive in the trap. And the benefit of the live trap is that if you are in an area where you're concerned about non-target captures, whether those be pets like cats and dogs or threatened or endangered species, if you capture any of those animals in a live trap like this, you can release the animal unharmed back at the site of capture. So that's the real plus about them. You cannot obviously do that with these kill traps. They're indiscriminate. So you can only use the kill traps in areas where you're not concerned about those non-target captures. The downside of the live trap, though, is that if you capture the target animal, you are responsible for euthanizing the animal after capture. And this is an important message that folks need to hear, because I get lots of questions about live trapping animals. And a lot of people think that it's okay to take the ground squirrel in this case somewhere else, maybe a couple of miles away, and release that animal so that it's no longer on your property. There are a variety of reasons why that's not a good strategy. But the most important aspect of it all is that it is simply illegal to translocate animals off property. It is against California Fish and Game Code to translocate those animals. So it is important to remember that if you're going to utilize these live traps, you have to have a plan in place for euthanasia. And there are two techniques that are currently considered humane for euthanizing animals here in California. Those would be shooting and the use of a carbon dioxide euthanasia chamber. Shooting is potentially the simplest option, but of course you cannot discharge a firearm everywhere. And so if you are in a location where you are not allowed to discharge a firearm, your option is the use of a carbon dioxide euthanasia chamber. It's a fairly simple process. You take the animal in the trap and you put it inside a container that will allow you to pump carbon dioxide into it. Carbon dioxide causes the animal to pass out and then eventually succumb to that gas. So that is the general process. At the end of my presentation today, I do have a website, a ground squirrel best management practices website that has details on this process. And so that is certainly something that you can check out if you want more information on it. Also, if it's something, it's always important to remember that if it's a process that you're not comfortable with, there are professional companies that you can hire to do some of this as well. And so that's an important item to keep in mind. We'll also use trapping for pocket gophers. Trapping, as I'll show you here in the next slide, can be a very effective tool for managing gophers. There's a variety of different kinds of traps out there on the market. This photo at the top right gives you an idea of what some of these traps are. They basically fall into what I consider two categories. There are squeeze type box traps like the Victor Black box here. There's also lots of pincher style traps such as the Maccabee, which has been around for well over 100 years here in California, but throughout North America. The Gophinator is a newer kid on the block, maybe about 15 years old or so. There's the cinch trap, which has also been around for about 100 years. But there's lots of other trap designs too, such as the Victor Easy Set, Johnson's Quick Set. A lot of you may be familiar with a newer trap called the Gopher Hawk as well. So there's lots of different kinds of traps out there on the market. All of these traps certainly do work to some extent, but there are likely some of these traps that are more effective than others. And I've done some testing over the years looking at the efficacy of some of these different traps. In particular, we've spent a lot of time testing the Maccabee, which is the green trap here, and the Gophinator trap. And what we ended up finding out in these comparisons is that the Gophinator actually was a more efficacious trap than the Maccabee, and the Gophinator was more efficacious primarily because it allowed us to capture larger gophers at a greater rate. And that's what this chart here at the bottom right is showcasing. What we have on this chart along the x-axis are different size classes for gophers, and along the y-axis we have capture rates. The Gophinator is represented by solid lines and the Maccabee by dashed lines. And what you see here is that for the smallest size class of gopher, it didn't matter which trap we used. They both worked equally well. But as we got into the larger and larger size classes of gophers, we started to capture proportionally more and more individuals when using the Gophinator. And in fact, this relationship was almost completely linear. So what does this mean? Well, what it means is that for each size class up in size for gophers that we were catching close to 25% more gophers when using the Gophinator. And that was compounding for each size class up to the point where we were getting out to the largest size class of gophers. We were still catching them with the Gophinator and no longer catching them at all with the Maccabee. So the Gophinator does seem to be a really good trap, and it's the trap that I've used for all of my subsequent studies on gopher trapping over the years. Now, we've also looked at the importance of covering trap sets. The basic premise here being that when you set these traps, you dig down into the tunnel systems, you set the traps, and then you have the choice of whether or not to cover that trap set up or to leave it open. If you leave it open, it makes it easier for investigation by you coming back to check the traps, but also it encourages potential investigation by gophers because they don't like openings within their tunnel system. Conversely, though, when you cover up that trap set, you're creating the illusion that there's nothing wrong within the tunnel system, so hopefully the gopher will travel up and down it like it normally would. So there's been a lot of debate over the years as to whether or not it was important to cover those trap sets. And so we did a study a number of years ago looking at the importance of that. What we found out is that it didn't really matter a whole lot whether or not you covered or uncovered those trap sets. We did see slightly higher capture rates in spring and summer during the hotter times of the year, but that increase was slight. And when we considered the amount of time it took to cover and uncover those trap sets, we actually were catching the same number of gophers per day with covered and uncovered trap sets. So it didn't really matter from that perspective. And we went into the cooler times of the year, which actually are the better times of the year to trap gophers. We actually had slightly higher capture rates with open trap sets. So for me personally, I generally use open trap sets. That said, if you're trapping in areas where you're concerned about access by people or by pets, particularly cats and dogs, things along those lines, it's a good idea to cover those trap sets. So there are times where you may want to cover and times where you can leave them open. Now, we've also looked at the importance of attractants. Do we need to use something like peanut butter or carrot oil or something along those lines to increase capture efficiency? In this case, we saw no real positive impact of using attractants. So I don't use attractants personally. Some people have noted slight increase in capture efficiency when using peanut butter if you're using covered trap sets, and we did see a small trend in that direction as well. So if you want to use covered trap sets, maybe there's a slight benefit to it. But personally, I don't see too much utility for using attractants for the most part. And we've also looked at human scent. Do we need to exclude human scent from traps, or can we touch them with bare hands without concern about human scent? This was very clear. Human scent had no impact whatsoever, and so I wouldn't really be too concerned about that when it comes to gopher trapping. So we've talked about some of the different tools that we can use to increase the efficiency of a trapping program, but we still haven't talked about how efficacious trapping actually is. That's what this data here is showcasing. It turns out that the trapping is a very effective tool, one of the most effective tools we have for managing gopher populations in ag fields. We've looked at it in wine grapes, we've looked at it in alfalfa. The results were very similar. After a couple of trapping sessions, we were looking at 92 to 93% removal rates with trapping. So trapping is a very effective tool when it comes to managing gophers. So now we're ready for our next set of questions. We have 3 questions again. So Peter, if you want to pop up the first one, thank you. So the first question, which of the following is not an effective management tool for pocket gophers and ground squirrels? Is it A, rodenticide bait application, B, repellents, C, trapping, or D, habitat modification? Okay, again, you're all doing great. The correct answer was B, repellents. There are repellents marketed for both of these species, but they really have not proven to be effective, whereas all the other tools can be effective. Okay, next question. Easier one for you, true or false? It is legal to translocate live trapped animals off your property. All right, most of you got this one right. The answer is false. It is not legal to translocate live trapped animals off of your property. If you do catch them in a live trap, you either have to release them where you captured them or euthanize them. And the last question, which of the following is a true statement about gopher trapping? A, attractants can greatly increase trapping efficiency. B, human scent does not impact capture success of gophers. C, trapping is not a very effective tool for managing gophers. Or D, all of the above. Yes, the correct answer is B, human scent does not impact capture success of gophers. Again, we didn't find much benefit for using attractants when it came to trapping efficiency. Trapping is definitely a very effective tool for managing gophers. The question is oftentimes about labor and is it cost effective from that perspective? And I don't have time to get into it here today, but I do have some data that suggests that trapping can be a very cost effective tool as well in many situations. Okay, so good job everybody. Moving on to the last segment of the presentation here today. So we're going to start off by covering baiting, and with baiting, I'm talking about the use of toxic baits or rodenticides for managing both gophers and ground squirrels. Keep in mind that these products can be restricted use or non-restricted use. It generally, it depends on a lot of different factors, such as who's applying the product, where it's being applied, what situations it's being applied in, etc. That being said, though, if we're talking about the use of rodenticides in production ag systems, they are generally restricted use products. So keep that in mind. You do have to be a certified applicator to use most of these in agricultural situations. For ground squirrels, there are two different kinds of rodenticides that we can use. The first is the first generation anticoagulants. Those would be difascinone and chlorfascinone. And then there also is the acute toxicant zinc phosphide. When I say an acute toxicant, what I'm talking about is a product that will kill the target animal after a single feed. The first generation anticoagulants, difascinone and chlorfascinone, are actually chronic feed materials. They generally require consumption of the bait over the course of several days for them to get a lethal dose. For pocket gophers, we also have the same products that can be used, as well as strychnine. Strychnine can only be used for pocket gophers, for no other species. The reason why we can still use it for pocket gophers is because we're applying the bait directly into the burrow system, where other species are not found. Keep in mind, gophers have closed burrow systems, so other species are generally not found within those burrow systems. We'll start off by talking about bait application for ground squirrels. One of the products that we have for ground squirrel control, in fact, the most commonly used rodenticide for ground squirrels are these first generation anticoagulants, difascinone and chlorfascinone. They can be applied in one of three strategies. Those are spot treatments, broadcast applications, or bait stations. Spot treatments are where you have a relatively few burrow systems to treat. What you do is you take a designated amount of bait and you spread that very thinly around that burrow entrance. You have to read the label on the products that you are using, because the amount that you will apply will vary depending upon the product that you are using. But I will give you an example. There is difascinone and chlorfascinone baits that are sold by some of the county ag commissioners' offices. I think the label requires the use of 1/3 cup of bait spread around 40 to 50 square foot around that burrow entrance. So you have to think about that a little bit. 40 to 50 square feet is a pretty large area. And so when you're spreading that small amount of bait over a large area, you're getting very few pieces of that grain per square foot. And very few animals are adapted to be able to pick up that kind of grain over when it's spread that thinly out there on the landscape. And ground squirrels are one of the few species that are adapted to do that. So it does make it a relatively safe approach for applying bait if you apply it according to the label. The problem is that sometimes they take that 1/3 cup of bait and people will spread it around a 2 or 3 square foot area around that burrow entrance. Now what you've done is you've piled bait, and when you pile bait, lots of animals can have access to that bait, and that's where you run into primary non-target risk, where you're concerned about direct consumption of that bait. So never pile bait. You have to follow the label instructions in order for those applications to be safe. Now, we can also utilize broadcast applications. So if you have a larger area with more extensive ground squirrel populations, you might consider a broadcast application. And that's where you use a seed spreader that's been calibrated to spread bait thinly out over a larger area on the landscape. Broadcast applications are good for that. Again, you're spreading bait very thinly, never piling it up out there. And thirdly, we have bait stations, which are used quite extensively as well. We have these upside down T-shaped bait stations, which are probably the most common ones out there, but there are also commercial bait stations that you can purchase and use as well. With these bait stations, of course, what we're doing is we're eliminating access to the bait by those species that are larger than the openings for those bait stations. And so they can be good from that perspective. Keep in mind, all of these approaches require multiple feedings. Anticoagulants, these first generation anticoagulants are a chronic feed material. So the animals need to consume them over the course of several days to get a lethal dose. So if you're using spot treatments or broadcast applications, that means you have to reapply the bait generally about 4 days after the initial application. Again, read the label because it can vary a little bit depending upon the particular product that you're using. For bait stations, you need to make sure that you're checking the bait stations and making sure that they maintain a constant bait supply. If you put the bait in on day 1 and don't check it again until 7 or 8 days later, it's possible that the ground squirrels consumed all that bait in the first day or two and then aren't getting access to it again on days 4 or 5. And if that's the case, you're probably just feeding squirrels and you're increasing the likelihood that they will develop a resistance to this particular product over time. So again, you have to make sure that you're maintaining a constant bait supply. I'm sure there will be questions about secondary exposure associated with rodenticides, and I'll mention it just briefly here. When we're talking about first generation anticoagulants, there can be some risk associated with secondary exposure. It's much lower than the risk that exists for the second generation anticoagulants, which we don't have time to get into today. I will just say second generation anticoagulants are used exclusively for rat and mouse control. They're not used for ground squirrels or gophers or anything along those lines. So the greatest risk is with those. There can be some risk with first generation anticoagulants. The best way to reduce that risk if using these products is to check for dead or dying ground squirrels on a daily basis and remove them from the landscape if you happen to find them out there. And we can talk about that more in the Q&A if people have more questions about that. Now we also have zinc phosphide, which is an acute toxin. And so zinc phosphide is registered for use for ground squirrels. It is generally applied only in spot treatments or broadcast applications. And the reason why is zinc phosphide has a very distinctive odor associated with it. Kind of a garlicky type odor, kind of a garlicky type taste associated with it as well. And that distinct odor and taste can lead to bait shyness in ground squirrel populations. What can happen is a ground squirrel can come, it can feed on 1 or 2 pieces of this grain, think that, you know what, this doesn't taste very good, so I'm not going to eat any more of it. When they do that, though, that those few pieces of grain that they consumed might be enough to cause them to feel ill. And if that's the case, then they can tie that sick feeling back to the weird taste in food that they consumed, and now they will no longer feed on it. So because of that, zinc phosphide is actually only allowed for use 1 time a year for ground squirrel control to minimize this potential bait shyness buildup in the ground squirrel population. One way to overcome potential bait shyness is to pre-bait. So you can pre-bait with non-toxic grain out there. Make sure that the ground squirrels are feeding actively on it, and then if they are, then you can come back in with the zinc phosphide product. One of the great things about zinc phosphide is that it has very low to almost no secondary toxicity risk. So if you're concerned about that, zinc phosphide can be a good tool to use. However, it is acutely toxic material, so it should not be used in or around buildings. And also because it is acutely toxic, meaning it can kill after a single feed, it is more hazardous to use from a primary toxicity perspective. And in fact, there are no antidotes for it as well. And so you have to be very careful with its use around pets, livestock, and things along those lines. The anticoagulants tend to be much safer from a primary toxicity perspective. And we also have rodenticides that can be used for pocket gophers as well. We've already mentioned we can use strychnine, first generation anticoagulants, and zinc phosphide. However, I will tell you that strychnine has repeatedly proven to be by far the most efficacious of the rodenticides for pocket gophers. And in fact, for me personally, if I couldn't use strychnine, I probably wouldn't worry too much about trying to bait some of the other products out there. Now, sometimes they do work, but the consistency hasn't been great with utilizing some of the other active ingredients for gopher control. Now, when it comes to bait application, we can do this in one of 3 methods. There's the funnel and spoon method, which is where you use a probe to poke a hole into a tunnel system and then spoon an appropriate amount of bait into that tunnel system. And then you plug that opening up, usually applying 2 to 3 times per burrow system. This works great if you have 2 or 3 burrow systems to treat, but you can imagine this gets quite labor intensive if you have to use this over a larger area. So we oftentimes see these all in one probe and bait dispensers used to apply bait over much larger areas for gopher control. certainly is a quicker way for treating areas. Basically, you just probe into the tunnel system, crank a lever or pull a lever to deposit a preset amount of bait into the tunnel system, and then move on. So you can treat areas much more rapidly that way. And in production ag systems, we can also use burrow builders, which are devices pulled behind the tractor that create an artificial tunnel system below ground, depositing bait at set intervals within that tunnel system. Then when the gopher comes along, when it's digging around, it can come along that artificial tunnel system, hopefully travel down that tunnel system, consume some of the bait, get a lethal dose. This is certainly the quickest and easiest way to treat large areas for gophers, but it also is fairly hit or miss. You have to get the depth right. You have to be doing it in the right soil conditions. You have to make sure the machine doesn't plug up. There are some tricks to utilizing it, and it doesn't always work as well as some of the other tools out there, but certainly it is a tool that can work in some settings. So the last thing we're going to talk about here today are burrow fumigants. With burrow fumigants, we're talking about the use of poison gas in burrow systems. We've already talked about the importance of soil moisture for utilizing burrow fumigation. Again, that's usually late winter through early spring for ground squirrel or for pocket gophers when we have that abundant natural soil moisture out there on the landscape, and then for ground squirrels after they emerge from hibernation in spring. And this is important though. We don't want to use fumigants when ground squirrels are hibernating. When they're hibernating, they plug themselves up within a nesting chamber below ground, and those gases will not get to them. So you do have to wait until ground squirrels are active above ground before you can start a fumigation program. It's very important that everybody understand too that fumigants should not be used around buildings. Burrow systems can oftentimes go up and underneath structures. We don't always know that because we don't always know where a gopher tunnel system or ground squirrel tunnel system is. And so we have to be a certain set distance away from buildings before we can use these fumigants. Make sure to read the label. Generally speaking, for most fumigants, I think they now require you to be about 100 feet away from structures. There's several different kinds of burrow fumigants that we can use. They include gas cartridges. Gas cartridges essentially are what I consider a glorified smoke bomb. You light a fuse, you insert it into the burrow system, creates a lot of smoke, a lot of carbon monoxide that will asphyxiate the animal. They do work pretty well for ground squirrels. We see on average about 75% efficacy when utilizing gas cartridges. They are also not a restricted use product. Anybody can go to the store and purchase them and use them for ground squirrel control. They are also registered and labeled for gopher management, but they do not generally work well for gophers. So we don't really recommend their use there. The other fumigant that we do have, or that we have had for a long time for managing gophers and ground squirrels, is aluminum phosphide. Common commercial products include phostoxin, fumitoxin, weevilcide, maybe a few others out there as well. They're basically pellets that you introduce into the burrow system that react with moisture within the burrow system, create phosphine. It's that gas, that phosphine that's toxic to the animal. This is a very effective tool. We see 97 to 100% efficacy for ground squirrels, 90 to 100% efficacy for pocket gophers. So in reality, it's probably the best, or certainly one of the best tools we have for managing gophers and ground squirrels. But it's also by far the most restrictive of all the products that we can use. You definitely have to be a certified applicator. You have to file a notice of intent, pesticide use reports, there's a fumigation management plan, and some other steps that you have to adhere to when using aluminum phosphide. But if you're in a situation where you can use aluminum phosphide and you've had extensive problems with gophers and ground squirrels in the past, this is one of the best tools out there for managing them. More recently, we've had the legalization of the use of pressurized exhaust machines here in California. There's 4 commercial products that I'm currently aware of. These include the PERC machine, which has been around the longest, the cheetah rodent control machine, the Burrow RX, and the CO Jack. All of these basically are designed to inject exhaust into burrow systems. So I have been doing some testing on these devices over the last 10 years or so. In particular, we focused on the PERC machine, which was the first one that I pointed out because it was the one that was initially around, the one that was around the longest and the greatest opportunity for us to test. We have tested it extensively for pocket gopher management, and what we've ultimately found out is efficacy of around 60 to 65%. So I would consider this to be a moderately efficacious tool for pocket gophers. Conversely, we have found it to be very efficacious for ground squirrels. We've looked at it in 2 species. There's Baldwin's ground squirrel, which is in the northeastern part of the state. A colleague of mine, Steve Orloff, looked at that several years ago, and he found that it worked quite well for Beldings. I looked at it in ideal moist soil conditions and had 100% removal rates for the perk machine for California ground squirrels. I also looked at it in really hot, dry soil conditions when fumigants generally do not work, and we still had 66% efficacy with these devices. So I was really quite surprised that it worked as well as it did in these hot, dry soil conditions. The other fumigants like gas cartridges and aluminum phosphide would not have worked near as well in that situation. So for me, the perk machine is a very, very good tool for ground squirrel control, a moderately efficacious tool for gophers. The only other one of these devices that I've actually tested is the cheetah rodent control machine. And unfortunately, in our situation, we actually had more ground squirrels after treatment than before treatment. So it didn't work really well for us in the trial that we ran. We haven't tested the Burrow RX or the CO Jack, so I don't have any specific information on them. I will say, though, that they're designed a little bit more similarly to the perk machine, I would guess probably that they'll work in a relatively similar manner. I will also just point out that there's another device that has been approved for use for burrowing rodents here within the last year, and that is a carbon dioxide injection device called the Eliminator. So that is a tool that's out there now as well. We haven't tested it extensively, so I don't have a lot of great information on that. But the feedback I've gotten and the information I do have on it suggests that it's probably pretty similar to these carbon monoxide injection devices, but I can't say that for certain. So that takes us to our last set of questions. The first one, strychnine is an effective and legal option for managing ground squirrels, true or false? All right, well, we have our first mixed bag here. 62% said false. That is the correct answer. Strychnine is an effective and legal option for managing pocket gophers, but not for ground squirrels. We cannot use it for ground squirrel control. Okay, next one. Burrow fumigants cannot be used in close proximity to buildings. Is this true or false? All right, very good. That is definitely true. Again, keep in mind that these burrow systems go in places that we don't know where they're going. And sometimes they can potentially go up and underneath structures. And so we have to be very careful about where we utilize burrow fumigants. And the last question. Okay, the use of multiple tools generally results in more effective management of burrowing rodents. Is that true or false? All right, great. Yes, that is correct. True is the answer. Again, keep in mind, integrated approach, IPM, we want to utilize multiple strategies to most effectively manage pest species, and that applies to burrowing rodents as well. So that's the primary content I have here today. I'll just leave you with some website information, some useful resources. Hopefully most of you know about the UC IPM Pest Notes and the UC IPM Pest Management Guidelines. Both of these have lots of really good information in them with respect to how to manage burrowing rodents and other vertebrate species. There's also the Vertebrate Pest Control Handbook, which is published by California Department of Food and Ag. I have been personally updating some of the chapters on them. The Gopher chapter is in fact updated, and so it contains lots of great information about how to manage pocket gophers as well. The ground squirrel chapter has not been updated. Some of the information is still good, but some of it is out of date. However, if you want to gain a lot more information about ground squirrel management, I strongly suggest you check out the Ground Squirrel Best Management Practices website. That's a fairly new website, contains pretty much all the information you're ever going to want to know about managing ground squirrel species. It also includes information about euthanasia, which I talked about earlier. And then lastly, I didn't have a lot of time to get into how management can be influenced by endangered species, but Generally speaking, if you're going to manage burrowing rodents such as ground squirrels and pocket gophers in ag or natural resource type areas, you need to first check and see whether or not threatened or endangered species might potentially be present in those areas. And one way you can do that is by going to this website put out by the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. Put in your section, township, and range information, and it will let you know whether or not there are potentially any threatened or endangered species present in the area. And if there are, it will tell you what you can and cannot do legally as far as managing your target species. So it's a great website to have at your fingertips as well. And so that's it. That's the information I have, but I'm sure it looks like we have lots of questions. And so how would you like to go about that, Cheryl?
Okay, so for this first one, ground squirrels are diurnal while barn owls are dusk to early night. So they don't seem to overlap for barn owls to be effective. Is that
yes,
true?
that is. Yeah, that is true. That is true. Yeah. Barn owls will feed extensively on pocket gophers, voles, and mice. Those are the primary critters that they're going to feed on. Ground squirrels, yeah, I would not rely on barn owls to manage ground squirrels.
Okay, the next one, I've seen growers use T-bait stations with a rat trap inside and peanut butter used as a lure to move rodents outside the leafy veg field to the outside area. So is that a combination of trapping along with exclusion?
Potentially, I guess. You know, I'm not quite sure what species they would be targeting there. Certainly food safety is you know, rodent incursion into leafy greens is a food safety risk, a food safety concern, and they're trying to keep them out. And so there's a variety of different strategies that can be used to accomplish that. They do certainly use a lot of bait stations. They use a lot of traps along the perimeter of those fields to try to keep the animals from moving into those leafy green fields. Sometimes we'll see exclusionary fencing, which can be used for certain species. We've looked at it for voles, for example, and it can be a pretty good tool to keep voles from moving into fields. Potentially for mice, although mice climb better, and so I haven't seen much in that. There's actually some recent research that's come out that showed that aluminum flashing fencing, which is what we use for voles as well, is very effective at keeping frogs out of leafy green fields, which is another food safety risk. So there's a variety of different strategies that can be used along those lines. So yeah, I mean, I guess you could consider it somewhat of a lure or habitat. I forget what did they classify it as? Was it exclusion, habitat modification? I forget, but it could be considered some kind of a combination approach, I guess.
Okay, the next one, is there a chemical marking of burrows where individuals can find or identify previous location of burrows?
I guess I'm not quite sure what they're asking on this. Maybe if the person could write back in and provide a little bit more detail. I'm not quite sure what they mean by marking, if they mean just knowing which ones they've applied bait at before or what. I see
Okay,
somebody
all
said
right.
something about spray paint, but so if you're talking about like marking just to identify which ones you've treated or which ones you've placed traps in or something like that, people regularly use wire flags, or they will use spray paint or anything along those lines to let them know that this is an area they've treated. If you're asking a different question, please feel free to ask again.
Okay, and the next one, do gophers prefer cover crops over vines and trees enough for the cover crop to be used as a trap crop?
That's a good question. So trap crops obviously are used for insects, I know. They've looked at the use of trap crops for a variety of different rodent species, and in general, the trap crops haven't really worked very well. Ultimately, what ends up happening is you put your trap crop out there, and it can be very good food. It can be a very good food resource for those rodents, but it can be so good that they proliferate like rodents, and all of a sudden you have more rodents out there, and the number of rodents can be way too much for that trap crop to hold, and then they move out into the ag areas, and then you start to see potentially even more damage from those rodents moving out into those ag areas where you're trying to keep them out of. So I would not consider the cover crop to be a potential trap crop to reduce damage to your actual crops. I don't think that's a strategy that's going to work, and it's something that's been looked at some in the past and hasn't really proven to be very effective.
Okay, can you use CO2 from a vehicle to euthanize?
Okay, so the question there, first of all, is technically it's carbon monoxide, which comes from your vehicle. And the short answer is no, not really. Now, there are devices that are sold here in California. You can go to a lot of hardware stores and find devices to attach to your vehicle to pump carbon monoxide into the Burrow system. DPR has been looking at this for several years now, and I think they finally came out with some kind of statement that basically is stipulating that no, they don't consider that pressurized exhaust. That is the key word there. I will take that one step further, though, and say that if we're talking about most modern vehicles, catalytic converters and whatnot are removing a lot of the carbon monoxide that's in the exhaust, so it would not be near as concentrated carbon monoxide as you get from these devices that you're purchasing and using. Also, vehicular exhaust tends to be hot. That can be an irritant, which could cause the gopher or the ground squirrel to either vacate the burrow system or build a wall real quick in the burrow system before it gets to a lethal dose to them. So long story short, I don't think in a lot of cases that the vehicular exhaust is going to be as effective. But according to DPR, I don't believe that's a tool that they consider to currently be a legal application here in California.
Okay. Does baiting ground squirrels cause issues if you have a cat in the area that you're baiting?
Right. So if you have pets, if you have cats or dogs in an area, you do need to be cognizant of the potential secondary risk associated with using anticoagulants. So if I was dealing particularly with, some kind of a backyard setting or something along those lines, I probably wouldn't use anticoagulants just because of that potential risk. So yeah, if you have animals that are frequenting those areas, pets in particular, that you're concerned about, then maybe you don't want to utilize that approach. I will say that if you're in a situation where you have a cat or dog that gets into bait, or you fear that maybe they consumed a dead or dying ground squirrel, gopher, vole, rat, something along those lines, you can take them to the vet. There's an antidote for the anticoagulants, and that's vitamin K. So it's a relatively simple procedure from that perspective. I say that relatively simple because for all of the rodenticides that are out there, they don't have antidotes for them. So it's much more complicated to treat the symptoms with those products, which is why we like to use the anticoagulants to a large extent, because they are safer from that perspective. But there can be some secondary toxicity risk. Of course, the best way to mitigate that risk when you're applying these baits in production ag areas is to perform daily carcass searches, and they are required on most labels now. You're required to go out there and look for any dead animals that might be out there and remove them from the landscape. You can do that in several ways. Probably the easiest way is to take the animal and put it back down into the burrow system as far into it as you can and bury it, close that opening up. So that's the simplest strategy. You can also, you have to check your local municipality. Every municipality can be different, but in general, you're allowed to double bag them. Basically, you take a garbage bag, you roll it up over your arm, or you reach down and grab the ground squirrel, unravel the bag, tie it up, put it in another garbage bag, tie it up, and then you can throw it in the garbage. So that's another way to dispose of that. But different municipalities have different requirements there, so you need to check them and make sure that's legal. Just always make sure, particularly when dealing with ground squirrels, you don't want to handle the ground squirrel, whether it be live or dead, because they can carry fleas, and it's particularly once the animal dies, those fleas can leave the animal. It's always going to be looking for a new host, and so you don't want to get the fleas on you because of potential disease transmission issues. So never handle ground squirrels with bare hands for sure.
Okay, we had a follow-up to the marker question. So it was not the human, but the squirrel marking the burrow with a chemical marker.
The squirrel, oh, like an odor kind of a deal. Maybe that's what they're getting at. Certainly, ground squirrels do mark burrow systems. I don't know of any way for us to actually physically tell that, but they do mark burrow systems, which is part of the reason why they found out that they had to get down to at least 1.5 feet in depth for burrow destruction, because if they were going shallower than that, the ground squirrels could smell that there were other ground squirrels that used to be in that particular area, and they would dig out that old burrow system. It's just 1 foot of tunnel they had to dig, and all of a sudden they had their old burrow system back. So yeah, there are chemical markers that ground squirrels have and they use to communicate, but I don't know of any way that we can tell that. So hopefully that was the question they were looking for.
Okay, the next one. Why can't one drown an animal caught in a live trap?
So the simplest answer is that legislatively the law was passed. You're just not allowed to do that anymore. Building upon that further, it's because drowning is not considered a humane form of euthanasia. It used to be a long time ago, but no longer is considered a humane form of euthanasia. And whether or not something is actually humane or not is not a topic that we really have the time to get into today, because it's mostly driven by personal beliefs there. What one person considers to be humane, somebody else may not consider to be humane. And the legal definition of what is considered humane varies from country to country. And it's predicated on a lot of different factors. But the simplest answer here is that it's just it is not legal for use in California.
Okay, how do you get the animal into the carbon dioxide box after the live trapping?
So there, what you're going to do is leave the animal in the trap. You just leave them in the trap. You just put the whole trap into the device, put the lid on, and then pump the carbon dioxide into it. You would never remove the animal out of the trap, because that would be hazardous for the handler.
Okay, the next one. Is there an obvious visual cue to distinguish between ground squirrel and gopher habitats?
No, they will utilize the same habitats. So you'll find them in the same areas oftentimes. Certainly you can tell the difference between gopher activity and ground squirrel activity, because the ground squirrels have open burrow systems. They're about 3 to 4 inches wide and in diameter. Usually, sometimes they can be quite a bit larger, particularly if the ground squirrels have had a colony there for an extended period of time. Whereas gophers have closed burrow systems, they have lots of mounds associated with those burrow systems. Sometimes you will find a gopher burrow system open. That's because they're currently excavating it, and those openings are about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches in diameter. So that there are obviously differences in size there.
Okay, should you wait to pick up a dead ground squirrel a day so the body can cool down and fleas leave the carcass?
I would say no. And the reason why is, if you leave it out there for a day, then it's more likely that a scavenger could come along and pick it up. If we're talking about zinc phosphide, that's not so much of a concern, because we don't have that secondary concern with zinc phosphide like we do with the potentially do with the anticoagulants. What you can do is take some kind of we use a permethrin dust, but some kind of dust to dust the area so that it can potentially kill any fleas that have been out there. Again, make sure you're utilizing gloves or something along those lines, or you know, if you have a dead ground squirrel that's next to a burrow entrance, and what you're going to do is bury it down in the old burrow system, you'll just carry a shovel with you. You'll stand back from it, use the shovel to kind of navigate it into the burrow opening, so that you're not getting right next to the animal.
Okay, the next one. What do you cover ground traps with? If you put dirt back on it, would it set the trap off?
Okay, so here we're talking about pocket gopher trapping, and there are various different ways that you can cover those. What we did is we used black cloth, and we just cut squares out. And so we dig the hole, we set the traps, and we put the cloth over the top, and then we take some of that loose dirt and seal the edges so no light got in. That worked well for us. If you have, and the nice thing about that is you can crumple them up in a bucket, and so it doesn't take up too much space. If you're in a turf setting, the easiest thing to do is just cut out your hole of turf and cut out the hole in the turf, leave that plug of turf whole, if possible, set it to the side, and then you set your traps, and then take that piece of turf back and put it right over the top, and that works well too. People have also placed buckets over the top of the hole. They've taken pieces of plywood and put that over the top. It's really kind of whatever you want to do. But you are right that you don't want to take loose dirt, generally speaking, and just put it back in there. Now, that said, when you're putting these traps, particularly these pincher style traps like Gophinator Maccabees and those styles, you're going to take that trap and you want to put that all the way up into that tunnel system, as far back up in there as you can. You definitely need to get it as far as the trigger mechanism. Make sure that trigger mechanism is completely within that tunnel system, because if you leave it out, there's a very strong likelihood that the gophers are going to plug up that trap before it ever gets to that trap mechanism. So you need to get it as far into those tunnel systems as you can before you cover them up.
Okay, for residential purposes, what is an available brand of strychnine for use with gophers?
So it's getting more and more challenging to find. Strychnine production is quite limited now. It's all imported. My understanding is it's almost all coming from India. So there are very few companies that are still manufacturing strychnine. I don't find it in stores at all anymore, or at least I haven't in the last year or two. You might be able to find it online, but I haven't looked recently, so I'm probably not going to be a lot of help on this one. The best advice I could give you is to look online, do an online search to look for a strychnine product. I do think that there are still companies out there that are selling strychnine for homeowner use online, but I'm just not sure what they are. So you'd have to do some looking on that end, I'm afraid.
Okay, there's a question about propane devices used for ground squirrel control. Is this device effective and allowed in California?
Right, so these are what we call gas explosive devices. They're a device that injects a mixture of propane and oxygen into a tunnel system. It's then ignited, basically it blows up. And so it's supposed to kill the animal through a concussive force. They are legal for use in California. You have to be very careful where you use them because you're blowing things up, right? So never in an urban residential area anywhere along those lines. If you're out in a more remote rural setting, then yes, you can use them. It's strongly recommended that you contact if you're using them in a rural area, that you contact your sheriff's department before you start that process, because loud explosions, people are going to come out, they're going to want to investigate. So it's good that they know that that's actually going on. As far as efficacy though, they really have not tested well for us. A colleague of mine tested them for ground squirrels, only about 30% efficacy. That's not very good at all. I've tested them for pocket gophers, again, about 30% efficacy, so not very good. So there's lots of other tools out there that work better than those gas explosive devices.
Okay, how did you measure efficacy for carbon monoxide for gophers or ground squirrels, dead animals, mounds, and excavated burrows?
So efficacy can be identified in a variety of different ways. For most of our studies, we've looked at indirect monitoring tools to assess efficacy. So for ground squirrels, what we do is we establish plots out there. We count ground squirrels into plots before treatment, and then we apply treatments, and we come back and we count ground squirrels after treatment. We look at that ratio of ground squirrels before and after treatment. I mean, there's more to it than that, but in a nutshell, that's kind of what we do. We also use burrow counts for ground squirrels, where we plug up burrow systems and count the number that have been reopened before and after treatment. For gophers, we can use mound counts, or we can use open hole methods, where we look at the number of burrow systems that are replugged to determine occupancy of sites, and we look at that occupancy ratio before and after treatment. So those are some of the common tools that we use. Again, there's a lot more detail to it than that, but for time constraints here today, I'm not going to go into too much more on that. Conversely, we can use radio transmitted individuals to look at survival for those radio transmitted individuals, and we have done that for ground squirrels and for voles and some other rodent species as well. It's more costly, so we're not able to do that as often, but that's another strategy.
Okay, how difficult is it to set a gophinator trap? Do you have any tips for that?
So the gophinator is a relatively easy trap to set. There are instructions on the gophinator website, but if you go to my personal website, it's baldwin.ucdavis.edu. And you can just Google me at UC Davis. You'll find my website. I have a video on how to set the gophinator trap. It's actually not me, it's a colleague of mine. But she's showing how to set the gophinator trap. And then I also have a 5-minute video on how to trap gophers, and I think it's a very good video, if I do say so myself. It's a good video on the trapping process for gophers, so I definitely encourage you to check that out. And there's lots of other information on my website too about managing vertebrate species of all sorts.
Okay, what do you recommend for shooting them?
I'm not going to get into too much on recommendations for shooting. What I will tell you is that for shooting to be an effective, well, okay, I guess I'm not sure whether they're referring to shooting in a trap or shooting as a control strategy. I'll just address it as a control strategy. The biggest thing there is you need to be very persistent. Keep in mind, when it comes to effective rodent management, we generally want to see a target reduction of about 70% of the animals out there in a particular area to consider the tool efficacious. That means you need to shoot 70% of the ground squirrels out there, and that can be pretty labor intensive, and so oftentimes other tools are more practical. But there are settings, particularly in rangeland settings, people will, and alfalfa too to some extent, they will use shooting as a primary tool to manage ground squirrels, rabbits as well. The caliber that you use, the cartridge, all that, it's up to you as far as what you want to use. Do keep in mind though, in California, lead bullets have been banned statewide, so you no longer can use lead. You would have to be using a lead alternative, and that goes for euthanizing an animal in a trap as well.
Okay, are there any cover crops, especially any legumes, that are less desirable to vertebrates? And is there a good place to find these lists of less desirable ones for organic growers looking to supplement nitrogen?
Unfortunately, no, I don't have an answer for that. Generally speaking, all legumes are preferred by gophers. They're preferred by voles, etc., at least to my knowledge. It's possible that there's something out there that I don't know about, but for the most part, no, they're all fairly preferred food resources. So I don't have a lot more to add to that. The cover crops that I do sometimes see people use, and obviously they're not using it for nitrogen fixing purposes because there's no nitrogen fixers out there, but people will plant just a variety of grasses or wheat or barley or oats, things along those lines sometimes as cover crops. And those are not generally highly preferred foods for gophers. And so if you're using a cover crop for some reason other than nitrogen fixing, then that's something that you could consider there.
Okay, do you have a reference for the law saying it is illegal to translocate trapped animals? Somebody's searching for that.
It would be on the California Department of Fish and Wildlife website. I can look for it. If somebody wanted to send me an email, I could look for it and try to get them that part of the code there. But off the top of my head, I'm not quite sure exactly where that's at. I'd have to look for it first. The code is extensive to sift through.
Okay, is there any research on the use of salt as a rodenticide?
No, I haven't seen anything specifically for salt. I've seen research where they've used salt as an additive to some of the rodenticides to try to increase the palatability of some of the products out there. Conversely, there is sodium nitrite, which is, it's a salt of sorts. It's used as a food preservative, and they're looking at it as a tool for managing a variety of vertebrates, most notably wild pigs, actually, where it's already registered as a pig toxicant in, I believe, New Zealand and Australia, although I'm not 100% certain on that. And they are looking at it as a potential pig toxicant here in the US too. And they have been looking at it some as a rodenticide as well, but we're pretty far from it being registered as a product yet, I think.
Okay, have you heard of baiting gopher traps with potatoes?
I have not heard of it specifically. I've heard of a variety of different items. A lot of people will use alfalfa, for example, as a potential attractant to bring them into a trap. Um, Personally, I wouldn't expect the potato to be all that attractive to the gopher versus using no attractants. Based on our experience, it just doesn't seem necessary. The gophers are pretty easy to capture regardless of having any kind of an attractant out there.
Okay, do you have any experience working with burrow blockers? And if so, do you find them effective?
I have not tested the Burrow blocker, and I don't know anybody that has tested the Burrow blocker. But for those individuals who don't know what it is, it's basically it's a device that it mixes a slurry of sand and water to inject into the burrow system. All I have is very limited anecdotal information on it. The information that was provided to me is that if you are in flat terrain, they saw some efficacy with it, but if there was any kind of slope, the slurry did not feed back up that slope very well. So that's about all I can tell you on that. And I will say it's a very expensive product, and so for a lot of folks, it's probably going to be out of their price range.
Okay, there's a couple questions about other animals eating the bait. So if other animals such as a fox eats a squirrel, which is eating the bait, will it die too? And then there was a follow-up about deer eating bait.
Okay, so let's tackle the first one first. The secondary toxicity risk. That really depends on the product that you're using and how much of the toxicant the animal consumed. Generally speaking, I would, there's no way, first of all, there's no way to know for sure. Oftentimes we assume that it would probably take 2 or 3 carcasses for a lot of these predatory species to get a lethal dose. But each predatory species has a different susceptibility to these anticoagulants. So coyotes are not the same as foxes. Kit foxes are not the same as red foxes. Bobcats are not the same as all of them. There are different levels of susceptibility to those anticoagulants. And even within species, there are individuals within that population that are going to be more or less susceptible to the anticoagulant as well. So what might constitute a lethal dose for one red fox might take 3 or 4 of them for a coyote or something. It just depends. And we don't have a lot of great information about the susceptibility of all these different species out there. So the best answer I can tell you is we don't really know for sure. It's something that is continually being looked at more and more, and we're trying to get a better understanding of what that potential risk can be. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about the deer one. So we did have the question about deer as well. So the risk to deer should be quite minimal if the bait is being applied properly. Keep in mind, with spot treatments, with broadcast applications, we're spreading it very thinly, just a few kernels of grain per square foot. Deer are not going to lick up anywhere near enough of this product. It takes a lot to kill a deer anyways. It's going to have to lick up a lot of dirt and everything else along with it. So we would not anticipate any kind of negative impact from proper application of rodenticide in that capacity. Where you could potentially have some risk is if somebody does not apply the spot treatment properly. In other words, they put a pile of bait out there, then yes, there could potentially be some risk there. Same thing if you have a bait station where somehow the bait station got knocked over, which by the way, you are required to tie up those bait stations securely so that that doesn't happen. But if something like that happened and you got a pound or so of bait that fell out on the ground, then yes, something like that could consume that. But if the product is used properly, then the risk to something like deer should be quite minimal.
Okay, just a comment from a fumigator. Wanted to stress the importance of reading and following the label, and if in doubt, to not use it.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. You have to be very cautious where you use these Burrow fumigants, and the labels are generally very descriptive on how they should be applied. I would take one step further on that, and you know, if you want more information about the fumigants and how they can be legally applied or how to interpret the label, things along those lines. Most of the county ag commissioner's offices are very good about providing information on that. So certainly feel free to reach out to them too if you want information, particularly as it pertains to the regulation side of how to use those products.
Okay, we have a couple questions on how long are typical gopher tunnels, and then also how is that determined for bait or fumigation?
So gopher tunnel systems can vary a lot. They can be pretty lengthy, like 30, 40, 50 feet in some cases, perhaps even slightly more than that, but that's quite rare. They're not generally that long. What usually happens is a gopher digs around, is constantly digging, is constantly creating new tunnel systems, and when it's done with an old tunnel system, it plugs it up with loose soil, and so it's no longer in use anymore. How that would pertain to Burrow fumigation, you know, it can be a little bit tricky. With aluminum phosphide, usually you're trying to apply aluminum phosphide twice per Burrow system. We don't know where the tunnels go, so it's a best guess effort out there. But you're usually trying to apply it twice so that it gets to all parts of that tunnel system. For the pressurized exhaust machines, where that comes into play is to how long do you inject the exhaust into that tunnel system. This has not been studied extensively. It's actually something I would like to look at, and how long you actually need to pump the carbon monoxide or exhaust into the Burrow systems. What we've generally done is about 3.5 minutes. If you suspect it's a larger tunnel system for some reason, you might pump it in there longer. And I know some folks who go for a longer period of time when they're injecting the exhaust in there. So how big you think it is can influence how long you might pump the pressurized exhaust into it. So, I mean, I guess that's how I would answer that one.
Okay, there's a question about a squirrelinator that can come with a tub to submerge the cage in water. Is that legal to euthanize the ground squirrel that way?
Yeah, that's what I was alluding to early on, where some of these traps that you buy do still come with tubs to drown. And that's why I wanted to stress the fact that no, that is not legal. They are still selling them for that purpose, and they shouldn't be in California. It is technically legal in a lot of other states, but here in California, it is not, because there was a law passed that banned that use. So, yeah, no, you shouldn't be using those tubs to drown them. The squirrelinator, by the way, is a multi-catch trap. It allows you to capture multiple squirrels at once, and so it can be beneficial from that perspective.
Okay, why are spring traps not effective on heavier individuals? Is it age, sex, or size related?
So I assume they're talking about the Maccabee trap here. Keep in mind the Gophinator is a spring trap too. It's just a different design. With the gophinator, what happens when the trap is triggered, there's an arm or the jaw, it swings over and around and grabs around the gopher. Whereas with the Maccabee, it has kind of an upward thrusting motion. And so when the triggers, those larger gophers, my guess is that that upward thrusting motion actually pushes those larger gophers kind of out of the trap some, to where it doesn't capture them securely, and then the gopher is able to wiggle out of it. Whereas with the gophinator trap, that arm swings over the top and grabs them over the top and holds them in, and now they can't get out. So that seems to be the primary mechanism for why you have that difference in capability of catching those larger gophers.
Okay, does very moist soil deter gophers or squirrels from digging?
Very moist as in really wet, yes. But as soon as it dries out, you know, a day or two, they're back out there going at it. So, you know, when you're watering your yard, or if we have a 2 or 3 inch deluge or something along those lines, you don't see a lot of above ground excavation by gophers, for example, for a day or two, maybe 3 days after that. But after that, soil starts to dry out just a little bit, all of a sudden you see a real explosion of activity, and they're really moving through those areas. So, you know, long term, you're not going to be able to I don't think, be able to keep them out of an area by keeping it, you know, that saturated and that wet. It does bring up one point though. Flood irrigation can be a really good tool to help manage gopher populations. Unfortunately, we're losing the ability to flood irrigate in a lot of areas, but we still can use it to some extent. And so if you're somebody who has maintained the capabilities of flood irrigation and have the water to do so, that can be a good tool to help reduce gopher populations in an area.
Okay, just a couple more here if you're still okay on time. Do ground squirrels feed on olive pits?
I don't know definitively, but my guess is no. I don't think that there would be enough nutritive value to that.
And I think that's about it.
Oh, there was one question. I will answer this one yet. Dry ice, somebody asked a question about dry ice and whether or not that could be used. Dry ice has not been approved as a pesticide for use against ground squirrels or gophers. Technically, in urban areas, it has been approved for the use against Norway rats, maybe roof rats too, I'm not sure, but definitely not for gophers or ground squirrels. So it's not a legal application. It's not something that we would recommend.
Okay, so I think that's it. But we still have a few people left on here. But thank you so much for your presentation today. We really appreciate that, and we appreciate everybody sticking around.
Great, you bet. Happy to help out.
So thank you very much, everybody, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.